Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webinar, The Impact of COVID-19 of Hospital Procurement and Supply in APAC. I'm Dana from APAC Med. APAC Med is a trade association representing all the stakeholders involved in the MedTech industry in Asia. Happy to be here. Please know that at the end of this webinar, we will send a post-webinar survey. So please have a look and fill in. Thank you. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Dana. Hi, everyone. Good morning. And welcome to our webinar, where we'll be discussing and assessing the impact COVID-19 and the pandemic is having on hospital procurement, supply, and MedTech in the APAC region. My name's Andrew Lee. I'm Vice President here at our MedTech division at Decision Resources Group, part of Clairvate. We'll have two sessions today, the first being an overview of the MedTech industry and outlook, driven by an assessment on procedures, procurement, and hospital supply. And the second is going to be a fireside chat with the three industry leaders from the region, Mr. Probir Das, Mr. Art Butcher, and Ms. Effie Wu. So our first session will be presented by Sana Siddiqui. She's a principal consultant on our consulting team here at Decision Resources Group, part of Clairvate. She has over a decade of experience delivering strategic insights to leading healthcare and medical device companies globally. This includes things like landscaping and forecasting, market opportunity assessments, customer segmentation, product development and adoption studies, product attribute and trade-off analyses, and competitive deep dives. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Sana.
Thank you, Andrew, and I will just share the presentation on the screen and get started. Okay. So hello, everyone. And as Andrew mentioned, for this part of the webinar, I will be discussing the impact of COVID-19 on the MedTech markets with a specific focus on how COVID-19 has impacted hospitals across the APAC region. The insights that we'll be sharing with you today are derived from DRG's detailed analyses of the secondary data, combined with insights that have been collected through discussions with hospital procurement managers and executives from prominent hospitals in China, India, Australia, and Singapore. So let's first begin by looking at the global MedTech market and where it was before the pandemic. So specifically, the global medical device market has seen steady growth of roughly 4 to 6% over the past 5 years. And the global market was valued at approximately $400 billion in 2019. The Asia Pacific market, or the Asia Pacific region, has made up approximately a quarter of this total, so approximately 25%. However, we've seen a major impact globally on this market as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, as most of you probably already know, the impact of COVID-19 globally has been unprecedented, and conditions continue to evolve on a daily basis. Now, to date, we have seen over 20 million cases worldwide and over 750,000 deaths. And across the world, we have seen people, governments, and healthcare systems struggle to adapt and address this challenge. Consequently, we are seeing a negative impact on the MedTech markets as a whole. So if we look at this globally, we see that the US has seen the greatest impact due to the limited implementation of lockdowns and behavioral changes. The caseloads in the country are the highest globally, but mortality rates have been more under control comparatively. Europe became the epicenter for COVID-19 in late March and early April, but the situation has been brought under control by countrywide lockdowns and large-scale testing. Europe has also suffered high mortality rates because they were one of the first victims of this pandemic. But with effective treatment and more extensive diagnostics, they have managed to reduce mortality rates across most countries in the region. In comparison, the APAC region has seen much less of an impact. Now, COVID-19 started in China around December, and with stringent lockdowns quickly put into place, they have managed to reduce the impact and recover quickly relative to other countries. South Korea has also managed the pandemic well, leveraging rigorous testing and seeing smaller secondary waves. Japan has also seen a lower comparative impact as it has managed the disease mostly through effective implementation of behavioral techniques like social distancing and the use of masks, as well as through effective contact tracing, though there have been some spikes in cases more recently. In contrast to these APAC countries, India has seen a more negative impact. Despite implementing a lockdown and increasing testing capabilities, India has seen a sharp increase in caseloads because of the high population density in the country, which has resulted in distressing the healthcare system in the country. Now, to evaluate this impact, we took into account a variety of different factors, and these include the duration of the pandemic resulting in government responses to that pandemic, which would include, for example, social distancing measures along with the extent of imposed shutdowns. We also looked at macroeconomic factors, including GDP trends and unemployment rates. We also took into consideration the electiveness of various procedures relevant to a particular market, in addition to evaluating patient profiles and associated mortality rates in order to determine if procedures must proceed despite the pandemic or if they can be deferred to at a later date. We looked at COVID-19 caseload for each individual country. And finally, we looked at the personnel available and facility capacity to manage the influx of patients suffering from COVID-19, in addition to the capacity to take on other non-COVID cases. Now, when evaluating how COVID-19 has impacted procedures, we must first consider the nature of the procedure. So specifically, whether the procedure is elective and may be postponed for an extended period of time, or potentially canceled without being detrimental to the patient, or if the procedure is what we refer to as deferrable, in that it may be postponed for a certain amount of time, but cannot be postponed indefinitely. In addition, we also looked at if the procedure is considered urgent and must be performed immediately, or else the patient will face detrimental outcomes. So while the guidelines that you see here are adapted from the guidelines and recommendations provided by CMS in the US, countries across the APAC region are adopting a very similar type of tiering system to help guide their actions during these times. And among the hospital administrators that we spoke to, many stated that hospitals across the APAC region were mandated to defer or reschedule elective and deferrable procedures in efforts to enable resources to be redirected to managing and treating COVID patients. So in some cities, hospitals were mandated to transform fully into COVID dedicated facilities. That meant that they had to refer urgent patients to other hospitals and then reschedule all other procedures. In other facilities, it was mainly the elective procedures that were mandated to be rescheduled for far into the future. And then the deferrable procedures were rescheduled at the discretion of the physician or the hospital, depending on the potential patient outcome, while other more critical procedures were allowed to continue or continue to be allowed to be continued. This deferral of procedures has created a shift in the demand and prioritization of supplies, with specifically a decrease in the demand for surgical supplies, along with an inventory surplus of products, for example, such as orthopedic implants, for which procedures have been temporarily halted. At the same time, we have also seen a surge in the demand for products such as personal protective equipment or PPE, oximeters, ventilators, blood pressure monitors, and other devices that are used in the management of COVID patients. However, despite the deferral in procedures, the essential nature of surgical procedures will result in a rapid recovery for most of the MedTech industry. And in some countries, as social distancing measures and lockdowns start to ease up, we are already seeing some procedures return. So looking at the graph on the right, you can see that the impact of the pandemic will result in a sharp decline in procedures. However, once we cross over into the recovery period, we see a sharp increase. The decline is sharpest for elective procedures, but the spike in recovery is actually highest for the urgent procedures. Now, in terms of recovery, we anticipate that most of the procedures that were deferred during the height of the pandemic will be recovered before the end of 2021. Elective procedures, however, may not fully be recovered until 2022. In addition, there will be some procedures that will not be recovered at all due to a variety of factors, such as, for example, patients dying during the pandemic or before receiving treatment, or patients whose conditions may change or worsen during the delay, and therefore those patients will require completely different treatment. And for elective procedures, there may be some loss due to economic conditions, with patients losing their insurance coverage or no longer being able to afford to pay out of pocket for those procedures. Now, many hospitals are planning or preparing for a potential spike in procedures once this pandemic ends. However, we must also keep in mind that there's also a patient decision factor in all this, particularly for elective and deferrable procedures. So while we do anticipate many procedures come back once we start seeing relief from this pandemic and some economic recovery, we may also see that some patients continue to opt to defer their elective or deferrable procedures over continued concerns of the risk of infection or exposure to COVID-19. In addition to the impact on procedures, hospital administrators and purchasing managers have also highlighted a change in processes that have resulted in response to COVID-19. For example, the surge in select product demand has caused a shift in inventory management models. In addition, the shortage of supplies has encouraged hospitals to expand their network of suppliers to secure much needed products. Also, significant delivery delays have resulted in a slight increase in preference for local suppliers. And restrictions in live meetings has caused most facilities to adopt an online procurement process and also caused some facilities to extend their current formularies and tenders. So let's deep dive into some of these factors. Beginning with looking at the change in inventory management models. Now, prior to the pandemic, the most prominent inventory management model that we saw across the APAC hospitals was the ABC analysis model, in which products are categorized and prioritized for ordering based on consumption value. However, now what we are seeing is that many hospitals have been switching to the just-in-time inventory management model, where they are only ordering what is required at the quantity needed in order for them to maintain their stock. Now, in terms of communication with suppliers, the biggest change that we have seen during this pandemic has been a shift to using video conferencing and teleconferencing in place of in-person meetings for meetings that focus specifically on product demonstrations and contract negotiations. This, of course, should not come as a surprise to anyone given the social distancing measures that have been put into place globally. We are also anticipating that some of the changes that we are seeing now will result in some long-term changes to expectations and minimum standards to supply chain excellence. So some of these standards may include evaluating the supplier's decontamination process as a standard part of supplier reviews, expectations of suppliers to conduct more frequent sanitization activities across their warehouses, and to do so at a more frequent basis, contactless deliveries becoming more of a requirement, an expansion in the network of suppliers that facilities will turn to during periods of high product demand, and communication using digital platforms becoming a more common and permanent means of communication. Now, as mentioned earlier, we have also seen a slight increase in the proportion of products being purchased from local suppliers at the expense of regional and international suppliers. And this has been in response to the major delays that we've seen in deliveries due to this pandemic. So in addition, we are also seeing governments across the region implement policies and mandates to increase domestic manufacturing. For example, in China, there is a goal of increasing the share of domestically produced medical devices in hospitals to 70% over the next 5 years. In India, the government has approved a plan to invest over $500 million US to boost domestic manufacturing of drugs and medical devices. Australia is emphasizing domestic manufacturing in what is referred to as areas of national priority, which would include medical devices and pharmaceuticals. And in Japan, the government has engaged with hundreds of domestic companies in an effort to bolster local production. Now, post-pandemic, hospital procurement stakeholders do not anticipate any major cuts on medical device purchasing. So the vast majority of procurement stakeholders that we spoke to explicitly stated that they need to continue to provide services and they must continue to purchase devices in order to do so. And they will not sacrifice on the quality of the devices that they purchase in order to provide care for patients. However, the exception here is in the area of capital equipment purchases, which may be affected by economic conditions following the pandemic. For equipment that is at the end of its lifespan and must be replaced, those equipment will be replaced. However, facilities have identified equipment that is on a more of a regular replacement cycle. Those particular instances are where we may see the delays in purchasing. So in particular, public hospitals may opt to delay scheduled system replacements and extend the lifespan of their existing systems if their budgets are cut due to poor economic conditions. So if we tie the markets back to the categorization of procedures that we discussed earlier, we can anticipate that the markets for elective procedures, particularly, for example, those in dental and aesthetics, will experience very high overall market impact. Similarly, in the capital equipment markets, such as imaging and healthcare IT, where device purchasing is not closely tied to procedure volume, we will also see a very high overall market impact on these markets. Now, in contrast, the markets focused on urgent procedures, such as many of those that are in the cardiology and trauma segments, will experience comparatively much lower impact overall, while markets for devices used in deferrable procedures, such as those in urology, gynecology, and orthopedics, will see medium impact, but faster return to normal levels compared to the elective procedures. And if you look at this from an overall medical device market perspective, the graph on the left represents the overall growth and market we were forecasting for the Asia Pacific region prior to COVID-19. And the one on the right shows the updated forecast as a result of this pandemic. Now, we continue to monitor and update our forecasts as things change and conditions change globally. However, if we were to assume that economic recovery will start in the latter part of 2021, we can expect that 2020 will be a slow year for market growth, followed by a spike in growth in 2021, and then a return to pre-pandemic levels by 2022. And with that, I would like to thank you all for your time, and I will pass it back to Andrew for the Fireside chat.
Thank you, Sana. And appreciate that overview of the pandemic and the numerous challenges presented to the APAC MedTech industry in particular. So for the second part of the webinar, it'll be a fireside chat with the industry leaders that I introduced earlier, again brought to you by DRG, part of Clarivate in association with APAC Med. So to discuss this impact, I'm delighted to be joined by Mr. Probir Das, currently Chairman and Managing Director of Terumo Asia Holding, overseeing operations across Asia Pacific and India. Probir has 3 decades of experience in the MedTech industry across a variety of domains. He currently sits on the board of directors for APAC Med and the Medical Technology Association of India. We also have joining us Mr. Art Butcher, who's currently Executive Vice President and President at Boston Scientific in the Asia Pacific region. Art has been with Boston Scientific for over 20 years, most recently holding roles as President of Endoscopy globally and Vice President and General Manager Endoscopy in Japan. And again, pleased to be joined by Ms. Effie Wu, the Asia Pacific Supply Chain Lead for the Surgery Business at Ethicon and J&J. Effie has extensive experience across several consumer and medical device business units at J&J, including supply chain, procurement, external manufacturing, M&A, and process excellence across the APAC region. So Mr. Das, Mr. Butcher, and Ms. Wu, firstly, I hope you and those you care about are keeping safe and well. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us. My pleasure.
Thanks for having us, Andrew.
Thanks for joining. So we saw in Sana's presentation the effect the pandemic has on the industry, particularly in the region. We touched on several themes, including manufacturing, supply chain, and spending and consumption, and the impact on those broad market dynamics. And of course, we're all living in the new normal of social and physical distancing. So Mr. Das, maybe we'll start with you. And how has the social and physical distancing affected your ability to manufacture and deliver devices?
Thanks for that question, Andrew. While our manufacturing plants across various geographies, Japan, China, US, Europe, and Asia Pac, of course, along with the distribution centers that we have managed to stay mostly operational. We have seen some impacts in our plants, say in Philippines and India, because both these countries have had very prolonged and very severe lockdowns. And these have caused challenges with staff movement, transportation, so on and so forth, more than just social distancing. Also, when you look at social distancing has created some capacity compromise in the partial manual assembly lines and in some warehouses. But quite frankly, the demand is down. So while the capacity is a little compromised because the demand is also down, we are able to service supplies to the full, or mostly to the full. Initially, there were other challenges with regard to domestic and cross-border transportation, but now I think we are seeing that mostly eased. It's a lot better than what it used to be for the last 40 to 60 days. So net, suffice if I say that on a global basis, we are more or less back to fighting levels of operation and being able to service our clients to their requirement.
Very interesting. So an impact on demand kind of paired with the challenges we've adapted and we're meeting that demand. Maybe Mr. Butcher, are you seeing anything different internally in regards to the impact, specifically social physical distancing or in manufacturing and delivery?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's definitely been an interesting journey. I'm sure a lot of similarities that we have had. For us, in the early days of the pandemic, and we have a manufacturing footprint that's in the US, Costa Rica, Ireland, Malaysia, and a couple of other places. Early in the pandemic, sort of Q1, when we got the notion that this really could spread, we were in I would call it hyper productivity mode. And actually, the signal was, let's order raw materials and let's build as much as we can, in case we're having to shut down plants or have supply be impacted, which was it's a fortunate decision in retrospect, because it did allow us to get some bulking inventory ahead of what was to come. And so from that moment of, I would say, hyper productivity, the journey went to a situation where as the virus spread, we had to, change our layouts in the plants and move more towards shift work, prioritizing certain products that are truly most life-saving, life-sparing, to make sure that we would be able to supply those to the market. So really tough and interesting decisions had to be made all the way along the road, but I praise the agility of the team for sticking with it. And then ultimately we had to close all of the plants for about a month as the COVID cases in different areas rose higher. And then now we're in a mode where we've come back almost to full capacity. And to do that, we have had to institute more spacing on the lines. We've instituted protective barriers between product builders. It's, you're already in a clean room environment, so the notion of PPE and behavior in the line is well understood. But I think maybe what was a big learning for us in a pandemic situation is a lot of the risk for disease transmission is happening outside of your facilities, right? So we focused heavily on employee education around how to protect yourself inside the plant and outside, because ultimately what happens outside the plant is impacting our ability to produce products in the plant. So at this point, the other thing I would note, which I think is interesting, and I'll be curious to hear if others have seen it, was just like Probir said, we did have a radical reduction in demand in most things, but in certain places it was sort of like the toilet paper surge, where distributors and hospitals wanted to stock up because they're like, I see it now, I want to take it so I have it in case the pandemic gets worse. And that made production planning even more challenging, because that's not a forecastable event where somebody sort of clears the shelf of a certain product. And we've had to deal with that as well.
That's very interesting. I wonder how predictable that could be as we move forward, but we'll talk about that as well. But interesting points. And if we shift to you, Miss Effie, right? If we're thinking about what we've heard so far, we're hearing kind of shifts in demand, challenges or changes or adaptation on the manufacturing side. Would love to hear what you're seeing, particularly as it relates to supply chain, and how do we ensure that supply chain is sustainable in this environment. What have you seen?
Definitely, sure. Thank you, Andrew, for the question. So I guess the effects of the global COVID-19 pandemic is definitely undeniable, as we already heard from the first 30 minutes from Sana, and also Mr. Das and Mr. Butcher also mentioned how they are dealing within their companies, right? So I think it's very similar. However, I guess as we are all the MedTech companies, one thing the pandemic doesn't change is really our commitment to ensure people around the world continue to receive access to the products they need to stay safe and healthy. So there are a couple of things we are doing from a supply chain perspective. First and foremost, I think it's really to stay very close to what our customer needs right now at this moment. Because of the pandemic, what they are looking for and how they are changing is really critical to success. And this means potentially a shifting focus from one product or service to another. I think Mr. Butch also mentioned just now, right? We're seeing some dynamics in terms of how the demand is moving. Some are going down, but some are become even stronger. So how we stay very closely communicated to our customers and also our sales task force from a supply chain perspective to really understand that is very important. Secondly, I would say a robust business continuity plan coupled with scenario planning is very important in supply chain, but also not just within supply chain, but end to end across the entire team from commercial customer to how we deliver the products to the customers, so that we are prepared for those unforeseen events. And always there could be a lot of dynamics going on. So while we know what will be the most possible or preferred option, always to have plan B and plan C is important. So when it comes, we will have more options to deal with. The third one, I would say, it's to draw on the past experience. Although I think the pandemic this time is very different or very unique, but also it's not the first time that we need to mobilize quickly to respond to a crisis. One example I can think of, for example, in 2017, we had Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, which is a major natural disaster. But what we have learned through that event, how we leverage our global manufacturing network, how we activating backup production sites and supply channels to meet the demand. Actually, all those are great learnings to help us get through this pandemic. And we believe what we have learned in this pandemic will also be a great asset in the future that we can learn from. Last but not least, I think we also heard from Mr. Butcher that the safety of our employees, because by ensuring that our worldwide employees are always working in a very safe environment within J&J and also taking precautions out of the company, is really to ensure that we are in a position to produce our products and services for our patients and customers who need to get them. I think these are some of the points I would say are very crucial from a supply chain perspective. And all we have done so far, I think this helped us to land where we are. We have been able to ensure a continued supply of our critical products to our patients as of today. And we will continuously monitor very closely as we move forward, because the situation is still very dynamic and changing every day. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Effie. So interesting points. I think we heard a theme across the board, right? Where we know we're challenged, where we need to stay close to our customers. We definitely noticed changes in demand, of course. We shifted our production accordingly, or maybe our supply chain accordingly, or adapted accordingly. But at the end of the day, right, we're interacting with our customers and need to stay close and understand how that their worlds are changing and how do we support them. So maybe if we're thinking about our end customers and our interaction with them, maybe back to you, Mr. Butcher, what are the key challenges you're experiencing in that aspect, right? Away from, call it, the Boston Scientific side of things, and then to the customer side of things, and that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for the end user, so I'm thinking the physicians and the hospitals. The changes, relative to industry interaction have been dramatic, just as for all of us, right, communicating in this new forum. So procedural access is the big challenge. So when you think about physician proctoring, think about physician training, sales rep training, servicing equipment, all of those things that we typically do on site with the end user have been challenged by this. And of course, necessity is the mother of invention, right? So it's amazing to see what the teams come up with to be able to continue to deliver excellent patient care, even in the face of being remote. So I've been impressed with innovations at Boston Scientific and across the industry with being able to now do effective remote proctoring for new types of procedures, which is a big deal, and it'll be game-changing long-term in terms of the speed and efficiency and cost efficiency with which we can roll out new procedures. And you have to have the right safeguards in place, but I think we've all learned a lot about the ability to do remote proctoring. Certainly, hands-on training in the past has always been a hallmark in the medical device industry that has to continue. But if there are ways to do it without actual physical interaction, that's what we've had to do during pandemic times as well. So we're leveraging virtual reality and augmented reality to be able to create shared spaces and do hands-on training from across town or across the world, and that's been pretty amazing to see. So one of the hopeful aspects of the pandemic, from my standpoint, is the ability to do these things remotely, and that goes for remote servicing of equipment, remote reprogramming of implantable electronic devices. It's forced us to make leaps and bounds because we're absolutely committed to improving quality of care for patients, even if we can't be in the same room. So that makes us have to get creative. Those are just a few thoughts, but it's been an interesting ride for sure.
That's interesting, right? It's always a stressor to improve the technology, to adopt new technologies. So fascinating that we're employing some of those, particularly the VR and AR piece. Maybe back to you, Ms. Wu. From your perspective, are you seeing any other innovative responses that have impressed you in regards to the interaction with customers?
Sure. I guess what impressed me the most is definitely the ability to accelerate the digital journey because of where we are in the pandemic, in the way how we connect with customers, both clinical and non-clinical, through virtual means. But the other aspect I really feel very impressed is the ability in the industry in terms of how fast we can respond to the changing customer needs. Some of example I can share, for example, in Ethicon, where we produce medical device in Johnson & Johnson, we were able to leverage our manufacturing network and the 3D printing technology, as well as with a collaboration with Prisma Health to make and distribute a Vesper ventilator expansion splitter at no cost, but also in terms of the days that it's from concept and design to launch in only 10 days, which probably was not able to happen in the past. I think the pandemic gives us a lot of challenges, but also a lot of great opportunities to showcase how fast we can react as a MedTech company to those most emerging needs in the market from the patient.
Yeah, agree, and no doubt a lot of shifting with the, with the ventilator needs, a lot of attention on the med tech industry in general. I'm sure it came out of this. Maybe back to you, Mr. Das. So, the rapid response that we've heard from industry, would love to hear from you any notable factors that you've noticed in your relationship with customers, in your in how you've responded, how you've seen the industry respond.
So essentially, a few areas. I think, not very different from what Art and Effie talked about. This has been a completely new revelation of what is possible in such a short time with regard to managing both contact and content delivery, because medical devices traditionally, for most parts, have been a very didactic industry. We are by the side of the customer all the time, right? And how do you manage contact in a contactless world? Like Art talked about, using VR and such tools to be able to, in our case, for example, we have done rather well in really scaling up some very highly acute hand-holding procedures, endovascular for an example, where you really need to be in the site or very close to the customer, sizing, case support, all of that. And we have adopted to such digital and remote technologies quite quickly. The other perspective that I wanted to bring is that when we talk about customer interaction, the core purpose, and we very strongly believe in Terumo, because the core purpose of every customer interaction is being able to serve them and to serve the patients, And in that, one of the challenges thrown at us was very quickly ramping up some manufacturing, especially in some very critical electromechanical devices such as syringe and infusion pumps, transfusion equipment that helps healthcare systems administer convalescence plasma therapy or emergency bypass systems. And we have been able to really very quickly scale up, very quickly scale up. Within weeks, we have been able to really scale up and support this unprecedented demand. I mean, for small examples, for a certain country, if they needed in a whole year, say 7 to 10 pieces of equipment, or maybe lesser, they suddenly needed 35, 36, 40. So, how do you then gear the back end to be able to get your vendor network in place, scaled up, really get, and this happened at the thick of the pandemic. I mean, today the borders are still a little bit open. You still get flights, at least cargo. But I'm talking about a time when, it has just set out and it was very, very difficult. So I think the teams did a fantastic job of really scaling up manufacturing and integrated supply chain to be able to deliver to these requirements. There are certain changes that I see in the customers' purchase behavior or tendering behavior. And because today's discussion is predominantly focused on that element, I wanted to just touch upon a couple. One is, if you look at several tenders across the region, especially because, I'm going to speak about Asia-Pac at this point in time, we are seeing many tenders getting extended, right? So, because many purchase organizations, as Sana did also touch upon that, many purchase organizations perhaps don't have the bandwidth to really call in for fresh tenders, new tenders. So that's one thing that I see. And the other thing, rather a challenge that I'm noticing in several countries that is under my watch, is that oftentimes purchase organizations are having to, they're being compelled to prioritize very much on low cost and high speed supply, and not as much as they used to be on the technical specifications and quality and so on and so forth. Now that, that might well be the right emergency response requirement, but I think the overall architecture of keeping quality in view for longer term patient benefit, for longer term health system strengthening is very, very important. And I'm sure that our buyers are cognizant of those needs, and we will together with them work in tandem to bring quality to the prime focus back again. Of course, that will mean that the manufacturers of such quality devices and systems will also have to ramp up their being able to be in time. That has happened quite aggressively. So I think we are all well placed, both from the customer side and ours. And lastly, with regards to being able to really partner customers, there is another element that is very important. In my opinion, treatment paradigms might change a bit moving forward, right? How do you build in infection control protocols, or how do you build in? Sometimes in some countries they might need to change the patient workflow a little bit, and that is where we are really trying to work country by country, because this is not necessarily a global solution. Oftentimes it's going to be a in-country, by-segment solution to be able to work with those customers and form, because we have the global view, We are operating in over 160 countries as Terumo Corporation. We understand the therapy areas really well. So we are able to then take that expertise and support the customers in forming their own SOPs and guidelines, and play a very strong partnership role to say, you know, when you bring in a patient, what do you do, what you not do, what you should not do, or when you are looking at patient workflow, what is that you do, what is that you should avoid, you know, and we have sort of a consulting outfit within Terumo. It's called Terumo Business Edge, which in some therapy areas like interventional cardiology would go and consult in creating better efficiency in systems. So we are riding on that sort of competency and trying to form these new paradigms for our customers in cardiac and vascular, in blood management, and you know, and of course across infectious disease or infection control portfolios that we have.
That's very interesting, and excited to hear how, you know, all of the industry has been adapting, partnering, and, you know, with the adaptation on the provider side, particularly, you know, a lot going on. I appreciate your commentary, especially on the tendering piece as well. So great to hear, and thanks for bringing those up. You know, do you want to shift gears? We want to touch on a few of the other themes that Sana did bring up as well. You know, one of the things that we are noting is the trend, particularly in the APAC region, with the growing focus on local or domestic supplying or manufacturing. It seems, and would love everyone's feedback on this, that this might be magnified during the pandemic for, you know, for a variety of reasons, some of them obvious, and themes that we've touched on so far. Maybe back to you first, Mr. Das, from your perspective, you know, what's driving this overall trend, and would love your commentary there.
Localization isn't necessarily linked to the pandemic. I think in most parts of the countries that we or the geographies that we serve in Asia Pac and even outside, there has been a localization trend or a compulsion, so to say, more than, in my opinion, that is much beyond just a scientific compulsion. You know, there are several other elements to that. Now, I would remind everybody, and people on this call perhaps are extremely aware of that the global size and the nature of medical devices supply chains is such that it operates on a manufacturing center of excellence model. It also operates on a development center of excellence model, which means that it is rather impossible and also perhaps not financially feasible to make every device in every country. Yeah, it's a global supply chain, and therefore, and also this is perhaps more particularly true for high risk, high tech devices. You know, I mean, come to think of it, you're trying to create a MRI in every country, you know, develop and manufacture, just doesn't work. Yeah. So in my opinion, in any pandemic situation, any pandemic creates panic, right? And any panic situation, not just MedTech, every industry, every form and manner of all industries, including medical devices, the not so globally competitive elements or sections of that industry seek more protection, and they would like to amplify on this panic and seek some sort of protection of local manufacturing, and thus influence a buy local, buy more local sort of policy. In my opinion, and this is my personal opinion, it would be important for policymakers in every country and buyers in every country to remember that high-risk, high-tech medical devices are most economical and most quality viable if they are not manufactured in a fragmented manner, right? And in that, it is very important to remain cognizant of trying to utilize a global supply chain. Of course, factoring for urgency, emergency supplies, and all of that. We have seen in this recent pandemic, we have seen some very brutal truths, right? In some country, in some countries, we have seen thousands of very rapidly produced local ventilators not working, right? And those kind of problems really create much more adverse impact than it's how do you say? Sometimes there are unintended consequences of a good intention, and we really need to make sure that we are cognizant as an industry, as a policymaker, and that is where APAC may play a very large role, and that's our intention, to play a large role, to be able to influence that thinking within policymakers to make sure that we realize what is the, you're not manufacturing a belt, or you're not manufacturing a bag, you're not manufacturing a bottle of soda water. It's very complex, and it's a very global supply chain, and no country is 100% import substitution capable in medical devices, and no country should be, as long as we are able to really cater to the demand of the patient, high quality, on time, physician-centric, patient-centric, then make local should be, heal local should be our priority, bigger than make local, is my opinion.
Yeah, a very interesting perspective. Nonetheless, we are seeing these trends, especially in the APAC region. Mr. Butcher, would love your commentary specifically on this local trend, and then your commentary on how the pandemic has influenced it.
Yeah, I'm highly aligned with Probir's view there. I think that the trend was with us and has been with us for some time. I do think that the pandemic certainly highlights the emotional desire for leaders of countries to be as self-sufficient in all regards as they can. We've certainly seen that, but I think this is a long-running trend, and the impact of COVID, gave it a little bit more voice, but it doesn't move the needle too much on the trend. I think that the point around the fact that we are in a highly specialized, high-tech sector is the key. And you've got this global supply chain where a single device could have 100 components, and those components are sourced all over the world, depending on who is as precise as possible in making that part of the widget. And that is very difficult to reproduce at large scale across thousands of different devices, despite the desire to do so. That said, there will be more localization, no question about it. And so as large players in the industry, all of us have to look at, okay, how do we address both needs in the market, which is for some devices, we're going to seek to localize where it makes sense and can be beneficial to the local population and the government's desires. But paramount is to be able to deliver the highest quality device that delivers the best possible outcome for the patient. So that's a balance, and I think you'll see certain segments of the industry will be more localizable than others. So the trend will continue to grow, no question about it. Difficult to do at large scale, but some things will move.
Yeah, appreciate that perspective as well. You know, I know we're getting close to time. You know, want to touch on a few other themes or points of commentary. So, you know, in addition to the challenges we've talked about so far, you know, we can look at our own businesses and see the impact that the pandemic has had on financials, to maybe how we run clinical trials, to maybe how we even pause or approach product launches, right? So we know that there's a big unknown on how the pandemic's going to be controlled moving forward. But clearly we need to think about what our world looks like moving forward in a post-pandemic or in a pandemic world, however this is going to develop. So maybe we'll go back to you, Ms. Wu. You know, are there certain behaviors or activities that you think that are being taken up here that might be sustainable moving forward, or would love your just general commentary on, you know, what does business look like for you moving forward?
Yeah, sure. I think the biggest learning from this pandemic, but also even from the past, is really how we constantly build capability that we will be more ready in certain situations like the pandemic, right? So a couple of things I think I mentioned early on is really, one is the capability of solid business contingency planning, scenario planning, and also frequent communication by utilizing the new way of working through digitalization. I think this has really helped a lot in this current pandemic. And always listen and attend to the most pressing needs from the customers and the patients. But also, I think also from a supply chain perspective, one thing we learn and we should continue to do is how to have a more flexible mode in terms of how we deliver products, how we are able to mobilize the manufacturing and the leverage of manufacturing network. That is also very important, so that we can quickly assemble the resource in those pandemic situations. And also, as we touch upon the localization, right? So it's not something we can do in a day. So this is really about how we have those long-term strategy in place. Where is the most needed place and the place that makes most sense to the patients, the market, that we need to build those capability in advance, but not only when it calls for action. So I think these are some of the points I think it's important as we move forward, even post this pandemic. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Wu. Back to you, Mr. Butcher, if we're thinking about the impact. What's the most striking impact that maybe we haven't mentioned yet on this discussion? Would love to hear your comments on that. You know, have you had to kind of reprioritize and rethink how you approach your day-to-day?
Certainly a lot of things, right? The biggest surprise, I guess, to us was probably how many procedures would fall into, you know, if you look back at Sana's chart, how many procedures actually fall into the deferrable bucket. So that, you know, historically, I would have, if I had to grade the procedures that we're involved in and that a lot of us on the phone here are involved in, I would have said that less of them were considered elective or deferrable. But we certainly found out that in a pandemic situation, more of our portfolio was deferrable than we had anticipated. But what we are seeing now, and is extremely important, is that they're not deferrable forever. And that's why I do believe, and we're starting to see it already, that a surge in procedures is coming and has in fact begun in a lot of places like China, where procedures are, you know, in returning to normalcy. So I think there's some great lessons there for governments and policymakers as well, in that you really don't, if you can avoid it, you don't want to take absolute moratoriums elective or deferrable procedures, because what we saw is there were a lot of deaths or negative events related to patients, non-COVID patients, not getting the care that they needed because it was deferred. So I think there's lessons for us all in the industry, but also in policymakers, like, let's be careful about that next time and make sure that we have a path to have designated non-pandemic hospitals or segments of hospitals, so you can continue to see not just the hyper urgent, but that, you know, the next two segments of the patient population, so that you don't have unnecessary negative events and mortality associated with it. Those are big learnings for us. I know we're tight on time, so I'll give it back to you, Andrew.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting perspective, and, you know, it's a big lesson learned, I'm sure, and I hope, right, globally. Maybe back to you, Das. You know, would love your final thoughts on, you know, the business. You know, how are we adapting? How is this looking like moving forward for you, and your commentary on how we've changed?
You know, I mean, for quite some time, people have been trying to fight their way through the COVID situation. Now, it's quite a clear reality realized now that we will have to live with COVID for a while, right? So I completely second what Art talked about in terms of not delaying the elective procedures, you know, because whether it is cardiovascular, cancer, renal, and a host of other things, every single day that you delay the procedure, you are really messing it more, right? So early intervention saves a lot of healthcare cost. And given the investments that the countries have not only made in healthcare, but also in subsidies, you know, really keeping the economies up, I don't think that the governments will have a lot of money to be able to pump in, you know, in healthcare and absorb those increased healthcare costs. So we have got to be very careful and smart about it. That said, the other thing that we really need to keep in focus, and I appeal to all the people on the call, you know, on this discussion, outside of it, the governments, everybody, we really need to bring patient confidence back. You know, today patients are scared coming to hospitals or going to an OPD. And that is something that we need to, you know, whether it's a governmental campaign or whatever it takes, you know, we really need to go and, you know, address patient confidence back. And lastly, it is extremely important for everybody to remember that in this environment, you know, all hands on deck, simplify, not more complexify, whether it is procurement processes or government policies. Like in Vietnam, we are talking about, you know, some public procurement documentation requirement changes coming up 1st of September. Now, those are, in my opinion, this is not the time for it. You know, I mean, we really need to accelerate on our ability to serve the patients quick and as best possible, and stay away from complexifying at this point in time. And I mean, I'm sure once the pandemic is past, there would be time for everybody to sit around a table and figure what is the best way forward. But right now, I think we need to all keep it simple and fast and agile. Yeah, I know we are a little extra, I mean, past our time. So back to you, Andrew.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and with that, you know, Mr. Das, Mr. Butcher, Ms. Wu, thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate the time to talk to us about this. You know, I found it fascinating. I'm sure everyone online did as well. So with that, maybe we'll wrap up. I know we're out of time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
All right.